August 2019. The world paused to laugh. Donald Trump, then President of the United States, reportedly asked a question that sounded like a punchline. Can we buy Greenland? Denmark's Prime Minister called the idea absurd. Late-night hosts turned it into a joke. The media treated it as another strange headline in an already strange era. But fast forward to January 2026, and the laughter is gone. Not because the idea became polite, but because the geopolitical valuation of Greenland became impossible to ignore. In the Arctic, climate is rewriting geography. In technology, supply chains are becoming national security. And in the age of AI, even cold is turning into a strategic resource. So here's the real question. What if Greenland was never a joke, but an overheard boardroom thought? What if the public accidentally heard how modern power actually speaks? Because if you strip away personalities, politics, and headlines, and look at the maps, the geology, the shipping lanes, and the balance sheets, Greenland stops looking like an island and starts looking like an asset attracting a sovereign suitor. This is not a story about ice. It's a story about economic geopolitics, where countries behave like portfolios and territory behaves like infrastructure. To understand Greenland, you have to stop seeing it as a place and start seeing it as a position. Greenland sits between North America and Europe. It touches the Arctic Ocean. It guards approaches to the North Atlantic. Any aircraft crossing the polar route passes nearby. Any missile trajectory over the Arctic intersects its surveillance envelope. Any future shipping corridor between Asia and Northern Europe bends around it. This geography has always mattered. During the Cold War, it mattered for nuclear warning time. In the 2020s, it matters for something broader, system control. But Greenland isn't a classic sovereign state. It is a self-governing territory within the Kingdom of Denmark, politically distinct, economically supported, and strategically exposed. That structure creates a modern vulnerability. Greenland is expensive to maintain, difficult to monetize, and increasingly valuable to outsiders. In investment terms, it looks like an under-optimized asset with rising strategic optionality. And in economic geopolitics, that combination never goes unnoticed. The United States never left Greenland. On the island's northwest coast sits Pitifik Space Base, formerly Thule Air Base, a critical node in America's missile warning and space monitoring architecture. For decades, the U.S. treated Greenland the way corporations treat leased infrastructure, as an operating expense, a base, a contract, a footprint. But by the mid-2020s, that model began to look outdated, because leasing access is not the same as holding equity. In business, there's a difference between renting an office and owning the building. One is a cost, the other is an asset. What Washington increasingly wants is equity-based influence, not symbolic ownership, not annexation, but durable alignment, the kind that shows up on a strategic balance sheet, not just a military map. That's the first pillar of Greenland's rising value, military geometry with asset logic. The second pillar is where the story accelerates.
For most of human history, Greenland was locked behind a physical constraint: ice. Ice made mining uneconomical. Ice made infrastructure sparse. Ice turned geography into friction. But climate change is altering the cost structure of the Arctic. As ice retreats, access improves. As access improves, optionality increases. As optionality increases, valuation follows. This doesn't mean Greenland suddenly becomes cheap or easy. It means it becomes possible, and possibility is what markets and states price first. But Greenland's value isn't only about what lies beneath the surface. It's also about what it becomes on the map. The Arctic will not replace the Suez Canal overnight. That's not how trade works. But it doesn't have to. Even partial, seasonal viability of Arctic routes changes planning models for shipping firms, insurers, and governments. Shorter distances between Asia and Northern Europe mean lower fuel costs, reduced transit time, and different risk calculations. In global logistics, time is leverage, and as Arctic routes become more predictable, leverage redistributes. Greenland sits adjacent to that redistribution. It doesn't just neighbor future trade routes, it helps shape who can use them, monitor them, and secure them. Greenland also carries strategic memory. During the Cold War, the U.S. experimented with extreme concepts beneath the Greenland ice, including Project Iceworm, an abandoned attempt to study whether mobile missile infrastructure could operate under a moving ice sheet. Camp Century, a research facility powered briefly by a portable nuclear reactor, was part of that experiment before it was abandoned as unworkable. In 1968, a U.S. B-52 bomber carrying nuclear weapons crashed near Thule, contaminating the area and triggering a large-scale cleanup. These episodes are not the reason Greenland matters in 2026, but they explain something important. Greenland has long been treated not as neutral land, but as strategic space, and today that logic is returning in a new form. Here's where Greenland becomes bigger than itself. Some strategists view Greenland as a precedent case, not for conquest, but for how influence is built in legally complex, resource-rich regions. Antarctica often appears in long-range planning discussions because its governance framework allows for review processes after 2048. Not expiration, but renegotiation. Greenland is not Antarctica. The legal regimes are different, the politics are different, but the logic rhymes. When resources become strategic, the rules around access become strategic too. Greenland functions as a real-world test of how modern powers project influence without formal annexation through finance, infrastructure, and security guarantees. A model sometimes described as security as a service, not control by force, but control by alignment. And this is only the opening act.
To understand why Greenland matters in 2026, forget flags again and look at materials. Modern power no longer runs on oil alone. It runs on a narrow set of elements most people never see, but everyone depends on. Rare earth elements, neodymium, dysprosium, terbium. These are the vitamins of the digital age. They sit inside electric vehicles, wind turbines, smartphones, satellites, precision-guided weapons, and the hardware that trains artificial intelligence. Without them, the modern economy doesn't collapse, it simply stops scaling. Here lies the structural imbalance. Over the past 2 decades, rare earth processing consolidated heavily in one country. China dominates the refining and processing stages of the supply chain. This dominance isn't ideological, it's infrastructural. And infrastructure creates elemental leverage. In a geopolitical dispute, leverage doesn't need to look like sanctions or missiles. Sometimes it looks like export licenses that take longer to approve, or quotas that tighten quietly, or supply chains that suddenly become unreliable. From Washington's perspective, this concentration represents a long-term strategic vulnerability. And this is where Greenland enters the equation. Geological surveys indicate that Greenland holds some of the largest undeveloped rare earth deposits outside Asia, including multi-element formations that are exceptionally rare at global scale. The Kvanefjeld region in southern Greenland has been discussed for years as one of the most significant of these deposits. But geology is only the starting point. Mining requires infrastructure, financing, political alignment, regulatory certainty. And that's where competition begins. China is not an Arctic country, but in strategic planning, geography doesn't end at coastlines. Over the past decade, Chinese state-backed entities showed interest in Greenlandic infrastructure and mining projects, airports, ports, and mineral extraction. The language was development. The structure was investment. From Beijing's point of view, this wasn't expansionism, it was supply chain insurance. From Washington's point of view, it looked different. It looked like dual-use preparation. A civilian port today can host a naval destroyer tomorrow. An airport built for tourism can support military logistics later. That's when Greenland stopped being a peripheral curiosity and started appearing regularly in U.S. strategic assessments. Because in economic geopolitics, infrastructure is never neutral. Who finances it shapes standards. Who builds it shapes access. Who maintains it shapes alignment. And once critical infrastructure is in place, influence becomes path-dependent. This is why Greenland triggered reactions far stronger than its size would suggest.
Resources explain why Greenland matters. Routes explain how fast it matters. As Arctic ice retreats seasonally, northern shipping routes are becoming more predictable, not dominant, but viable. This doesn't eliminate traditional corridors like Suez or Panama. It introduces optionality. For logistics firms and governments alike, optionality is power. Russia moved early to exploit this shift. It invested heavily in Arctic infrastructure and icebreaker fleets, treating the Northern Sea route as strategic space. The United States entered the mid-2020s with a clear asset asymmetry. Its Arctic capabilities lagged behind. Its logistics presence was thinner. Its ability to shape Arctic standards was limited. Greenland offers a way to close that gap, not by copying Russia, but by anchoring influence at a critical junction, the GI-UK gap, the maritime corridor between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom. This space has mattered before. In the Cold War, it shaped submarine warfare. In the 2020s, it shapes trade monitoring, deterrence, and Arctic to Atlantic access. From a systems perspective, Greenland sits across the flow. Now we reach one of the most under-discussed and most 2026 relevant drivers of Greenland's valuation: cold. For most of history, cold was friction, something to overcome with insulation, fuel, and energy. But as computing density exploded, cold flipped from problem to advantage. High-performance computing clusters, large-scale AI training systems, and quantum-adjacent architectures generate enormous heat. Cooling is no longer a secondary cost. In many facilities, it is one of the largest operational expenses. This created a new form of arbitrage: thermodynamic arbitrage, the extraction of value from temperature differentials. Greenland offers naturally cold ambient conditions, political stability, proximity to North American and European networks, and vast undeveloped space. In 2026, that combination began attracting interests not only from governments, but from big tech. This doesn't mean quantum computers suddenly appeared under the ice. It means planning horizons shifted. Cold became a strategic input, cooling became a profit variable, and geography began influencing computation. In economic geopolitics, control over computation increasingly overlaps with control over intelligence, finance, and defense systems. In that context, Greenland looks less like a mine and more like a platform. Put these layers together: rare earths as elemental leverage, infrastructure as alignment, Arctic routes as optionality, cold as thermodynamic arbitrage. Greenland stops looking like territory. It starts looking like a system node. A node connecting supply chains, logistics corridors, security architecture, future computation. This is not colonial logic, it is systems logic. And systems don't require ownership to exert control, they require dependency. Which brings us to the most delicate part of the story: Denmark, liquidity, and the structure of modern influence. Greenland is politically autonomous, but economically tethered. Each year, Denmark provides a substantial block grant that funds a significant share of Greenland's public budget. The arrangement was designed to support stability and gradual self-governance. But by 2026, the financial context around that relationship had shifted. After the energy shocks and inflationary pressures of 2024-2025, much of Europe entered a period of fiscal stress. Borrowing costs rose, budget flexibility narrowed, long-term commitments became harder to sustain without trade-offs. In that environment, Greenland increasingly began to resemble a liquidity trap on Denmark's balance sheet. Not because Copenhagen wants to disengage, but because the more Denmark invests to maintain stability, the harder it becomes to step back.
Greenland requires continuous spending on infrastructure, climate adaptation, transport, healthcare, and security coordination, while offering limited short-term cash flow under existing frameworks. From a balance sheet perspective, it is a high-cost, low-liquidity asset with rising strategic value, a combination that creates pressure even for well-managed states. This is the timing logic behind renewed external interest. Not opportunism, not ideology, but capital sensing stress. Inside Greenland, support for independence has grown steadily. The reasons are clear: cultural identity, political self-determination, and control over local resources. But independence in the modern world is expensive, especially for a population of roughly 56,000 people spread across extreme geography. A functioning state requires energy systems, transport and ports, digital infrastructure, healthcare and education, access to capital markets, long-term security guarantees. Symbolism does not fund these systems. Capital does. This is where economic geopolitics becomes unavoidable. Independence without capital often leads to dependency. Dependency with capital often comes with conditions. In geopolitics, there is no such thing as free money. There is only equity. Whoever finances development tends to shape alignment. Whoever underwrites risk tends to set terms. This dynamic does not remove agency from Greenland, but it constrains the menu of options available.
In the 21st century, influence rarely arrives through formal annexation. It arrives through infrastructure financing, long-term contracts, regulatory harmonization, security guarantees, capital dependency. This is equity-based influence, not ownership on paper, but alignment in practice. From this lens, Greenland does not need to be bought to be integrated into another power's system. It needs to become predictable. Predictable access, predictable security alignment, predictable exclusion of competitors. That is why discussions around Greenland increasingly resemble merger logic rather than diplomacy. Reduce uncertainty, internalize future upside, block rival entry, convert operating expenses into strategic assets. This is not about replacing Denmark overnight. It is about reshaping incentives until alignment becomes the lowest risk outcome. What emerges instead of conquest is a subscription model of power. Security as a service, supply as a service. Rather than seizing territory, major powers offer protection, infrastructure, and access in exchange for alignment, standards, and long-term influence. This model scales better than force, it looks less dramatic, and it is far harder to reverse. Greenland fits this model precisely. Its security requirements are high, its infrastructure needs are massive, its population base is small. In economic geopolitics, that combination attracts service providers, not conquerors. Greenland matters not only because of what it contains, but because of what it represents. It represents a shift in how power operates. In earlier centuries, borders were redrawn by conquest. In the late 19th century, they were stabilized by institutions. In the 21st century, they are increasingly softened by economics. Resources, infrastructure, computation, and capital now shape outcomes more reliably than ideology. Climate change accelerates this shift. As ice melts, constraints dissolve. What was unreachable becomes negotiable. What was symbolic becomes strategic. Greenland sits at the intersection of climate, capital, computation, security, trade. That is why attention around it continues to grow. So, is Greenland for sale? That question misses the point. The real question is who can afford to shape its future. In the language of economic geopolitics, control rarely comes from ownership alone. It comes from liquidity, leverage, infrastructure, and time. Denmark carries Greenland's past. Greenland negotiates its identity. External powers position for its future. And the future increasingly belongs to those who can finance it. In the world of parallax, borders are no longer defined primarily by blood or soil. They are defined by credit ratings, supply chains, thermodynamics, and technological advantage. Greenland is not a meme. It is not a joke. It is not a frozen backwater.
It is a case study, a preview of how power moves in a world where territory behaves like an asset and the coldest places may become the most valuable. This is Parallax. We don't just read the news, we read the map.